This week on the Nonprofit Newsfeed, of course, brought to you by Whole Whale, a marketing and analytics agency focused on helping nonprofits do more with their data. My name is George Weiner, the chief whaler of Whole Whale, and I have Nick Azulay, digital strategist at Whole Whale. We are both massive nonprofit geeks around technology, marketing, and of course news, which we track nonstop. Half of this is just so I feel like you and I can just talk about all of the ridiculousness going on. I think we need to prioritize when you are sort of being bombarded and drinking from a fire hose. And I loved your take on what we need to be looking at with regard to the dissolution of the USAID. So let's start there.
Yeah, George, there's a lot of news, but I think the big one, because its impacts are already being felt, is what's really been the dissolution of USAID, the United States official humanitarian aid agency. So this generally independent and bipartisan agency has seen mass firings, layoffs, furloughs, hundreds, if not thousands, of USAID employees have been laid off or locked out, kind of in this gray zone of am I actually still employed, including thousands of contractors that have also been laid off and suspect they're out of a job. So it looks like the agency is going to be absorbed into the State Department. A legally dubious, but as of now, apparently most likely outcome. And even if some programs get turned back on, it's clear that USAID's existence will never be the same. George, why this matters? USAID is the largest international development humanitarian donor on the planet. It's the main distributor for U.S. foreign assistance and distributed $40 billion in aid to more than 160 countries. And that's according to financial statements from 2023. USAID accounts for 40% of global humanitarian funding. And that money gets implemented partially by USAID directly, but most of it actually goes to implementation partners. So those are NGOs and local partners on the ground that are actually carrying out this work. So USAID is really playing the role of funder here. Something else to note, George, that I'm not seeing a lot of publications highlighting is that USAID also funds the United Nations. 2022, according to financial statements, USAID provided over $20 billion to United Nations and other affiliate organizations, including the World Food Program, United Nations Children's Defense Fund, or UNICEF, and even agencies like UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as the United Nations Human Rights Apparatus, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Some of those agencies, according to statements that have been given to the press, are experiencing anywhere from moderate to severe funding pitfalls within the UN system. George, something else I'd like to call out is that there's been a lot of talk about transparency and USAID is, a far left Marxist terrorist supporting whatever. The reality is that USAID, for the size, only accounts for 1% of United States federal funding, about $40 billion. And last year passed 63 financial audits. It's one of the most heavily audited agencies in government. For comparison, the U.S. Department of Defense has an $800 billion budget and has not passed an audit in decades. Just to put the financial, it's a financial black hole argument, just fully debunking that on the onset. George, why this is so devastating, unfortunately, is the speed in which programs were paused is likely to have cataclysmic ramifications, right? So we can debate, right? USAID is hardly above criticism. It's very clearly a way of the State Department to flex soft power around the world, right? It's been criticized for its top-down approach to development assistance. A lot of that's been really professionalized, I think, over the past decade or two, and the agency is not without its criticisms. Maybe there is a logic in roping it more into the supervision of the State Department. But George, you put this in a LinkedIn post, and that is the pulling out the IV aspect of this. There are so many programs, hundreds, thousands of programs that are being implemented by hundreds of NGOs and partners across the globe that are suddenly having to pause all activity. That's programs to fight deadly diseases, respond to famine, move towards sustainability, improve hygiene, and survive and rebuild after war. Those programs, if they exist, have probably been irreparably damaged. George, the speed of this is shocking. The sector, I think, is reeling. Hopefully, many of our listeners are a little bit isolated to this. This is a little bit more foreign assistance specific, George. But the ramifications of this for global humanitarianism are going to be massive.
Yeah, I'm watching a lot of folks parse the why of this being cut, and I'm much more concerned about the how. I think it's going to, when we are able to look at it with some amount of distance after the fact, potentially go down as a philanthropic disaster in the order of which we've never sort of experienced before. Why do I use the word disaster? Because building dependency and then pulling the rug is devastating. This is not like turning off the lights, right? Look around. You're in a room right now. There's a light switch. There's lights. Someone flips the lights. You still have a sense of where things are in the room. You know where the exit is and stuff like that. Now imagine instead of the words light switch, I use life support system and someone flips that switch. It's a completely different context if we talk about dependency built up over, frankly, this organization has been around since the early 60s under the Kennedy administration and has like gone in and out of many, many, many administrations. And I am glad that it's not just you point out the criticism, which I have long agreed there are issues with using the words soft power and philanthropy. Like anytime we're weaponizing philanthropy, like let's just like take a beat and understand what we're doing. But the fact that this dependency now has been built up across, I think, hundreds, like over 60 different countries and embed itself
160.
160 embed itself into communities, into systems, into health support and access to life-saving drugs and initiatives. Doing that at speed dictates in direct proportion the level of damage. Yeah, that's how I feel about it right now. And the second order effect is also, look, there's a bunch of people, like plus 3,000, as many as 17,000. I can't find a real number on the amount of like sort of direct jobs, either paused, furloughed, depends on where we are in this 90-day freeze, or if it's permanent, or if it's even legal. There are jobs. And if you cut off someone's paycheck for 90 days, you've really done an amount of damage. I'm also seeing across the sector, and including like agencies, so groups that work with nonprofits, like folks that are losing like, their book of clients or their work or their program overnight, which means the firing of those consultants. And a lot of people working in and around the nonprofit sector, consultants and agencies, are going to have the second order effect. So like the economic impact when you just flip a switch again, I am like literally getting calls from people being like, I don't know what we're going to do. This is unexpected and devastating.
Yeah, George, that's right. It's hard to actually pin down the number of people impacted by this because it's so multi-layered. There are so many NGOs, particularly US or European-based NGOs, may get upwards of 50, 60, 70% of their funding through USAID grants and programming costs, right? Like that's their by far their largest source of revenue to implement this programming. So not only the USAID staff is being affected, you have USAID contractors being affected, and then the employees of the NGOs implementing all the programs are being affected. So there's like three tiers there. And I think that's what makes this really scary. And George, you're right. You can make arguments criticizing the network of consultants and contractors that kind of are implementing this aid, right? Why is the staff in that status? There's a lot of criticism of that at the UN level too, right? So many people who work at the UN are really just contractors, but pulling out the IV while the planet's on life support, it's not without mentioning that we're seeing an increase in conflict and crisis, potentially large-scale migration and refugee flows from all various sorts of conflict over the past couple of years. The world's in crisis, was already in a dire place with humanitarian funding, and this is going to exacerbate it to no end. The new secretary for the office, the Commissioner of Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations, got sworn in 3 weeks ago. I'm sure he's having a fun time.
Other tiny thing you mentioned is the data aspect, which they literally make USAID.gov go to a 404 overnight. I'm, looking into, archive.org, which does have some of that history, but there are just terabytes of data, of research, of things that have probably informed other aid efforts over the years. That are they lost? Are they accessible? Are they sort of like deleted, or at least not accessible for the next 4 years? I don't know.
Yeah, George, I think that's a great point. And for despite all its faults, I think USAID has never been criticized for not enough reporting. The reporting requirements associated with those grants are onerous, to say the least. But you're right. What level of that knowledge or research or data is lost? I don't think we know yet. Maybe none of it, maybe a lot of it. Time will tell. All right, George, I want to take us into our next one. And we really just have to follow up on this story again. I don't think we have to go too deep into it, but the White House last week rescinded its executive order suspending government funding, really all kind of government payouts to all sorts of various programs. And the main suit brought by the National Council on Nonprofits and Democracy Forward has actually progressed. The lawsuit continued past that rescinding of the order. And just this morning, we're recording this on Tuesday, we found out that a judge has actually implemented a restraining order. Many organizations claimed that they were still locked out of their funding portals, which seemed to imply the executive order, at least in part, was in some kind of effect. And a judge has officially issued a restraining order forcing the administration to rescind, both in text and in practice, all aspects of that executive order. So a big win there for the National Council on Nonprofits. I'm sure we'll hear more from this over the coming weeks, but I think that's pretty much the main update.
Yeah, definite plus one. A lot of respect for what the National Council on Nonprofits is doing, and shows you, even if you get a judge ruling, it's still important to be listening to the community, filling out those surveys about, I'm still experiencing this, centralizing that so you can have a collective action. Because honestly, you're not going to get very far with the help support, the tech support right now, apparently being run by like 20-year-olds that Musk has brought in. So I love what the National Council on Nonprofits is doing, and we just kicked into February, so the watchdog work that they're doing is amazing.
Absolutely. All right, George, our next one, I think good news, cautionary tale. We'll let our listeners decide, but a month-long Canada Post strike. So that's the postal service for the country of Canada has ended. Basically, it ended over a month ago, but we wanted to talk about it because we kind of missed it. And George, I'm sure you can add more flavor to this because you were just in Canada. But the Canadian postal strike lasted from November 15th to December 17th, but importantly had pretty severe ramifications for nonprofits in Canada. I think it's not entirely clear the extent to that. There's some anecdotal reporting that organizations were hit in decreased revenues. Giving Tuesday occurred during that period. We started to get into end of year funding by the time the strike wrapped up. George, what do you want organizations in the United States to take away from this, right? What kind of thing did we learn about resilience from the Canadian postal strike?
I think, one level, you can't help it if you just get unlucky, and that happens. But if you do hear that these things coming, one of the reasons I brought it up is because I was actually just in Canada at a small conference, and it was fascinating to hear, like, this is actually like a massive countrywide and unfortunate like A/B test, or at least an A test, where what if we paused all of our direct mail? What would happen? I'm waiting for data to come out about this. As you said, anecdotally, I was talking to more nonprofits about this, that now, because that post was delayed, now it's like landing in people's like boxes as they're finally getting through the backlog, and they're getting some of these like large gifts in Q1, which is totally confusing. So that's like one thing. Like, interesting, is there a world where maybe people are willing to give large gifts in Q1, or is it simply because they weren't asked in December? But those pieces are being tested for, wait a minute, how effective was this? The other thing is that some organizations decided to spend more on their digital advertising and saw fantastic results. I mean, I was asking them, like, how far did you push it? Like, oh, we only increased it by, a small X%. And then we saw much higher returns. So it's like, are there better dollars spent elsewhere? We always do this because we've always done this. Is an interesting moment to be like, all right, I'm very curious, and we'll watch this for what can be learned. Is direct mail dead? Does direct mail matter more than we thought? Or is it still hard to tell because it must be in concert with multi-channel marketing? But the net takeaway is Canadian nonprofits definitely got hit with that one, with this longer, stronger postal strike in Q4.
Yeah, George, that's a great analysis and kind of an interesting one, right? Like, what happens if you just pull the plug on a major source of fundraising
What if we
for a
didn't
lot of
send that?
organizations? Yeah. But I think in some ways the lesson from those orgs that have been seeing great returns in January is the lesson in which the best email you can ever send is a correction email. I think the lesson from that is kind of similar, right? Like, oh, sorry about that last email. Everyone clicks on those, you know? So I think it's a similar kind of psychology there. All right, George, I think we deserve it. A feel-good story. This one comes from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it is about a man named Gary Mills, who founded the nonprofit Shoot Basketballs, not people on the nose, but he will attend Super Bowl. He will attend the Super Bowl thanks to the Philadelphia Eagles, who surprised him with tickets in recognition for his decade-long work combating gun violence through youth basketball programs. So the Eagles and 76ers recently awarded this organization $30,000 through their social justice fund. And Mills, whose nonprofit has worked with over 2,500 children since 2013, runs free weekly basketball programs and was featured in a 2023 documentary about Philadelphia's gun violence crisis. The recognition helps this organization secure its first official grant, enabling Mills to transition from working 2 jobs to running the nonprofit full time. That's amazing. George, you and I both went to college in the greater Philadelphia area. We are, I think neither of us are Eagles fans, but we're certainly rooting for Gary Mills.
No, I'm rooting for the Eagles. Fly, Eagles, fly on the way to victory. For those of you listening, EAGLES. Let's go. On that, we have a dad joke. Nonprofit dad joke. Football themed.
Football themed dad joke. George, you go ahead. I'm excited to listen.
So, why did the NFL give up its charity status, its 501c3 status in 2015?
I don't know.
They didn't convert on the fundraising drive.
I get it. Football, drive up the field. Football.
Yeah. Sports ball. It's a sports ball joke.
I love the sports ball.
All right. See you next time.
See you, George.